You're violating community code, Jake. Linda's voice cut through the morning air like a siren. She stood at the edge of my yard, pearls gleaming, clipboard raised like a sword. The bright orange citation fluttered in her hand, a scarlet letter against the wind. That's not a violation. I shot back, trying to keep my temper steady. That's a childhood dream sitting in my backyard. The sun spilled through the branches of the old oak, lighting up the small wooden fortress perched 20 feet above the ground. My treehouse, my son Evan's dream, stood there proudly, its cedar planks glowing gold in the light. I could still smell the faint mix of pine and varnish from the nights I spent building it. Every board, every nail, carried his laughter. Evan used to call it our castle in the sky. Now it was just mine. Linda Porter, our HOA president, didn't see a castle. She saw a code violation. This structure wasn't approved by the Architectural Review Committee, she barked, scribbling something on her clipboard. You were supposed to submit a design request before construction. You know that, Jake. I clenched my jaw. She didn't care that it wasn't some eyesore cobbled together with scrap wood. It was a handcrafted structure, perfectly braced and weatherproofed. The kind of project only a man with 20 years of contracting under his belt could build. But to her, it was rebellion, an imperfection in her perfect little neighborhood. The notice she taped to my fence read in bold red letters, "Unapproved structure, remove immediately or face daily fines." As she walked away, I caught sight of curtains fluttering. My neighbors were watching. They always did when Linda made her rounds, like she was a warden patrolling her prison block. I heard someone whisper, "He's gonna regret crossing her." Maybe I should have cared. Maybe I should have taken the paper, apologized, and promised to rectify the issue. But as I stared at the treehouse, my chest tightened with a different kind of grief, the kind that makes you stand taller instead of break. I remembered the night I finished the roof. Evan had been in the hospital that week. He never got to see it complete. Building it afterward became my way of talking to him again. Every plank I sanded down felt like one more day I got to spend with him. And now this woman, this rulebook queen, wanted to erase it. I walked to the base of the tree and placed my hand on the ladder, feeling the grooves I'd carved with my own knife. My tools still lay scattered nearby. The hammer, the old tape measure, the level Evan once used like a toy sword. This wasn't just a structure. It was a story carved into wood and memory. "Linda," I called out as she turned the corner. She stopped, her heels sinking slightly into the grass. "I'm not tearing it down," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Then you'll start collecting fines by tomorrow." "Morning. Do what you gotta do," I told her, voice low, steady. "But that treehouse isn't going anywhere." She smirked, turning back toward the clubhouse. "We'll see about that." The wind picked up, rattling the leaves above. I tore the notice from the fence, crushed it in my fist, and stared up at the treehouse. My son's castle, my rebellion, my peace. "You'll have to drag me down from that tree yourself," I whispered, the paper crumpling tighter in my hand. Because this wasn't just about a treehouse anymore. It was about standing up for what's rightfully mine. "Mr. Miller, you're out of order." Linda's voice echoed through the clubhouse like a gavel crack. "No, ma'am," I said, leaning on the podium. "I'm just tired of being pushed around." The HOA meeting had already gone on for an hour when my name came up on the agenda. Item number 7, unapproved structure, 19 Oakwood Lane. The room fell silent as I stood, the air thick with perfume and judgment. Rows of polished homeowners sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering behind glossy pamphlets titled "Preserving Our Neighborhood's Beauty." Linda Porter sat at the center of the board table, flanked by two nervous-looking members who rarely spoke. Her pearls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, her lips pursed in that tight, professional smile she wore like armor. She ran this HOA like it was her personal kingdom, one decree at a time. "Mr. Miller," she said, voice dripping with that practiced sweetness, "we all appreciate your enthusiasm for home projects, but rules are rules. The treehouse you've built violates Section 4B of the Community Guidelines. No unapproved elevated structures." I leaned forward on the podium, feeling the burn of 100 eyes on me. With all due respect, Linda, that treehouse sits within my property line. It's safe, inspected, and not visible from the main road. So tell me, what exactly is the threat here? The crowd shifted uneasily. Someone coughed. The board members glanced at each other, but no one spoke. They didn't dare. Linda's smile twitched, a crack in her porcelain mask. The threat, she said finally, is to uniformity. If we allow you to build whatever you please, what's next? A second-story shed? A pool slide over the fence? The rules exist for a reason. Uniformity. That was Linda's favorite word. The community she ruled looked perfect. Identical mailboxes, manicured lawns, houses painted in pre-approved shades of beige and sorrow. People didn't mow their lawns because they wanted to. They mowed them because they feared what would happen if they didn't. I scanned the room. Most neighbors avoided eye contact. They'd all been there before. Fined for trivialities, scolded for invisible offenses. Some even looked at me with pity, like I was already a dead man walking. I took a deep breath. You know, I said, I've served in places where people fought to keep what's theirs. And I'll tell you, it's funny how power works. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Other times, it hides behind a clipboard. The room went still. Linda's face tightened. This isn't about power, Mr. Miller. This is about order. Then maybe order needs a little shaking up, I said. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few neighbors actually nodded before quickly catching themselves. Linda's eyes flashed with something cold. Not anger, but control slipping. She tapped her pen against the table, then smiled again, the kind of smile that could cut glass. Well, she said lightly, we'll revisit this at next month's meeting. In the meantime, the fines will continue to accrue. Translation. She'd already decided my fate. The meeting adjourned. People shuffled out in silence, pretending not to look at me. As I gathered my papers, I felt a hand brush my shoulder. I turned. Linda stood close, perfume sharp and artificial. You think you can challenge me, Jake? She whispered, voice low enough that no one else could hear. I stared at her, unmoving. You'll wish you'd never built that thing, she said, her smile widening as she turned to leave. For a moment, I stood there alone in that spotless clubhouse, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the air. But under that sound was something else. Something building inside me. Not fear, not regret. It was resolve. You got another one from the HOA, the mailman said, shaking his head. I took the envelope, heavy as guilt. Final notice of fines, $250 per day. For a moment, I just stood there at the end of my driveway, feeling the paper tremble in my hand. The envelope was thick, overstuffed with warnings, citations, and that sharp chemical smell of printed ink, the smell of control. I didn't even need to open it to know what it said. More fines, more threats. More of Linda Porter's iron grip, dressed up in legal language. Inside, the paper spelled it out in black and white. Failure to remove the unapproved structure will result in daily penalties, property liens, and possible legal action. The words burned like acid. I wasn't just being harassed anymore. They were trying to crush me financially, make me bend until I broke. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had been simmering turned into something sharper. Strategy. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I trusted to give me a straight answer. Mike, you home? Mike Reynolds had been my army buddy years ago. The kind of man who could fix anything with duct tape and willpower. He'd spent the last decade running a small construction firm, helping guys like me deal with code inspectors and property lines. When I told him what was going on, he didn't even hesitate. Bring the paperwork, he said. We'll see what kind of crap they're trying to pull. His garage smelled like motor oil and sawdust, a comforting kind of chaos. I spread the letters across his workbench, each page stamped with the HOA's seal and Linda's perfect signature. Mike squinted at the documents, shaking his head slowly. Man, they're bluffing, he muttered. Half this stuff doesn't even apply to your property. Look here. He pulled out a folded map from his drawer, marked with faded survey lines. This is the county's zoning record for Oakwood Estates. See that? He pointed to a faint dotted line cutting through the back of my yard. That's the HOA jurisdiction boundary. Your treehouse sits about 10 feet outside their control zone. I blinked. Wait, you're saying they don't even have authority over it? Exactly. They can't enforce bylaws beyond that line, he said, tapping the map. HOAs love to act like they're mini-governments, but they can't override county building codes. You got the right permits when you built that thing? I nodded. Every last one. County inspector approved it himself. Mike grinned, that familiar soldier's smirk creeping across his face. Then Linda's firing blanks. She's using fear and paperwork to push you around. But legally, you're clean. It was like a fog lifting from my mind. For weeks, I'd been drowning in frustration, letting their rules box me in. Now, for the first time, I could see the cracks in their armor. The HOA had no real power over that treehouse. All they had was intimidation. I looked at the pile of letters again. They weren't threats anymore. They were evidence. Every fine, every notice, every scribbled signature from Linda was a trail of harassment I could use against her. Mike folded up the map and handed it to me. You keep this safe. That treehouse ain't just yours, Jake. It's proof that you don't scare easy. The late afternoon sun hit the metal tools hanging on his wall, glinting off the steel like a promise. I tucked the map under my arm, feeling something I hadn't felt since Evan passed. Purpose. I walked toward the door, turning back once more. If they want to fight, I said, a grin breaking through for the first time in weeks. They picked the wrong soldier. You can't add lighting without approval, Linda shouted from the curb, her voice slicing through the evening air. Guess you'll have to find me twice then, I said, flicking on the string lights. A wave of soft amber light spilled across my backyard, illuminating the treehouse like a beacon in the night. It shimmered through the leaves, warm and defiant, a quiet rebellion against the paper walls of the HOA. That night wasn't about construction. It was about reclaiming something they'd tried to take, peace. Every nail I drove into the wood was a statement. Every strike of the hammer echoed the same thought. I'm not backing down. The air was thick with sawdust and the scent of cedar oil. My hands were raw, calloused and covered in tiny splinters, but I didn't stop. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I'd rebuilt half the deck, added railings, and rigged up solar lights that made the whole thing glow like a lantern against the night sky. It wasn't long before the neighbors started to notice. I'd catch glimpses of them standing on porches, pretending to water their plants while sneaking looks toward my yard. Some gave me discreet thumbs up. One elderly couple even left a note in my mailbox that said, "About time someone stood up to her." Of course, not everyone approved. The next afternoon, a white sedan rolled up while I was tightening bolts along the ladder frame. Two men stepped out. Khaki pants, clipboards, and fake confidence. One flashed what looked like an ID badge before tucking it away too fast for me to read. "Afternoon, sir," the taller one said. "We're from the county inspection office. We received reports of unauthorized construction activity." I wiped the sweat from my brow. "Really? That's funny," I said. "Because I spoke to the county last month. They didn't seem too concerned." They exchanged quick glances. My gut told me something was off. That's when Mike pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, recognizing them instantly. "Those aren't county inspectors," he said flatly. "County IDs are blue, not white." The shorter man stammered. "We're just, volunteers conducting preliminary checks." "Volunteers?" Mike laughed. "You mean HOA spies. You boys better leave before I call the sheriff." The color drained from their faces. They mumbled something about miscommunication and hurried back to the car. I pulled out my phone and hit record just in time to catch their license plate as they drove off. Later that night, Mike and I sat on the back porch reviewing the footage. "You know what's crazy?" he said, sipping his beer. "Impersonating a county official isn't just dirty, it's a misdemeanor." That caught my attention. You serious? He nodded. Yep. North Carolina law. You can file a formal complaint, and the county has to look into it. For the first time since this war began, I felt the balance of power shift. Linda had crossed a line, and she didn't even realize she'd handed me the weapon to use against her. The next morning, I walked into the county office with a printed report, photos, and video evidence. The clerk looked startled when I mentioned impersonation by HOA members. She called in a supervisor, and within minutes, I was filling out paperwork for an official inquiry. When I left that office, the world felt lighter. The same sun that once mocked me now felt like it was shining in my favor. The wind through the oak leaves above sounded almost like applause. That night, I sat under the glow of those same string lights, watching the treehouse gleam proudly against the dark. For the first time, Linda wasn't the one pulling the strings. She was the one tangled in them. Violation: grass 1 inch too high. Violation: garden hose visible. Linda read them like she was hosting a game show. Only I was the prize. By that point, the treehouse wasn't just a structure anymore. It had become a symbol of defiance, a monument standing tall against Linda Porter's paper empire. And she hated that. Every time those solar lights flickered on at dusk, it was like a spotlight on her failure to control me. So she did what power-hungry people always do when they start to lose. She doubled down. The citations started arriving daily, sometimes twice a day. Bright yellow slips in my mailbox, on my porch, even tucked under my windshield wiper. Each one more ridiculous than the last. Mailbox paint slightly faded. Trash can visible from the street. Improper edging of lawn perimeter. It was like she was running out of real rules and making up new ones just to stay relevant. At first, I laughed it off. But when the fines started stacking into the thousands, the laughter turned into strategy. I stopped reacting and started documenting. Every notice got photographed. Every conversation recorded. Every envelope dated, sealed, and stored. I even started recording our encounters when she'd accidentally stop by my property for inspections. "Mr. Miller," she'd chirp, "I'm only here to ensure compliance. Then I'm sure you won't mind if I record this, just for transparency." I'd reply, tapping my phone screen. The way her smile froze told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't used to being held accountable. In North Carolina, the law was on my side. It's a one-party consent state, which means as long as I'm part of the conversation, I can legally record it. And trust me, I recorded everything. Over the weeks, my evidence folder grew thicker than the HOA rulebook itself. Dates, photos, time-stamped videos, voicemail recordings, each one painting a picture of harassment so clear, no lawyer could ignore it. I even caught her once muttering under her breath while leaving my property, "We'll see how much you love that treehouse when you're broke." Neighbors started to notice too. Some pretended not to, but others gave me quiet nods or whispered, "Hang in there, Jake. We're rooting for you." One even slipped an envelope under my door with screenshots of HOA emails, proof that Linda had been rallying the board against me behind closed doors. The community was starting to see her for what she was. Not a leader, but a tyrant. Still, the pressure mounted. I'd wake up to find HOA flyers taped to my fence, threats of liens on my property, and once, I kid you not, a measuring tape stuck in my front yard with a note reading, "Grass exceeds community standards." It was harassment, plain and simple, but I stayed calm. I knew patience would hurt her more than anger ever could. Mike kept reminding me, "Paperwork wins wars like this, not punches." And he was right. Every new notice became ammo for the counterattack I was quietly building. Then one morning, just as I started to believe I'd seen every dirty trick she had, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail. The return address wasn't the HOA this time. It was a law firm. I tore it open, and my stomach dropped. Notice of civil action, nuisance complaint. Linda had officially filed a lawsuit against me, claiming my treehouse was a community nuisance causing visual and social discord. Social discord, I actually laughed when I read it. But underneath that laugh was a realization that this fight had just gone from annoying to dangerous. I folded the papers neatly, placed them on my kitchen table, and stared out at the treehouse glowing faintly through the window. If she wanted a war, she was about to get one. "Mr. Miller," the judge said dryly, adjusting his glasses, "you're being sued over a treehouse?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, forcing a calm smile. "Apparently, it's a public menace." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the small county courtroom, but Linda didn't flinch. She sat 2 tables over, spine straight, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights, lips pressed into a self-satisfied smile. Her lawyer, a slick-looking man in a charcoal suit, whispered something in her ear, and she nodded like the queen she believed she was. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish, the kind of scent that carried a weight of history. Rows of neighbors had shown up, curious to witness the showdown. Some I recognized from HOA meetings, others were there for the spectacle. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting to see if the man who'd defied Linda Porter would finally fold under her pressure. Her attorney stood first, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association seeks enforcement of community bylaws pertaining to unapproved structures. The defendant's construction, an elevated wooden structure described as a treehouse, violates Article 4B and constitutes a community nuisance that lowers property values and disrupts uniformity." Uniformity. There it was again. That word had followed me for months like a mosquito I couldn't swat. The judge frowned. "And this structure is located on Mr. Miller's property?" "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer replied. But within HOA jurisdiction?" the judge interrupted. There was a pause. A beautiful, pregnant pause that made the room hold its breath. The lawyer glanced toward Linda, who gave a tight smile but didn't speak. "We believe so," he said carefully. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, setting down my folder of evidence. I didn't raise my voice, didn't show anger. I'd learned long ago that calm kills arrogance faster than shouting ever could. "Your Honor," I began, "this so-called nuisance sits more than 10 feet beyond the HOA's recorded boundary line. The county issued a permit for it 2 years ago. Here's the documentation. The HOA has no jurisdiction where that structure stands." The judge leaned forward as I passed him the paperwork. He adjusted his glasses again, studying the highlighted map Mike had helped me prepare. "And this was verified by the county zoning office?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Verified and signed." For the first time, Linda's composure cracked. She whispered urgently to her lawyer, who shuffled through his own files in confusion. The judge exhaled through his nose, the sound of patience thinning. "It seems to me," he said slowly, "that the HOA has overstepped its authority. This court will dismiss the claim of jurisdictional control. The fines and citations tied to this structure are invalid." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Gasps, whispers, even a quiet "yes" from somewhere in the back. I kept my eyes forward, not gloating, not smirking, just breathing. Linda, though, couldn't hide her fury. Her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. The judge continued, "However, I will remind both parties that community disputes are best settled with cooperation, not confrontation." Her lawyer mumbled an acknowledgement, but Linda didn't move. When the gavel came down, she finally stood, her heels clicking against the tile like gunshots. Reporters and neighbors followed as she stormed toward the exit. Cameras flashed, microphones rose, and her voice cut through the noise. "This isn't over, Mr. Miller," she hissed, pausing at the doorway. Her eyes were sharp, filled with something beyond anger, humiliation. "If the law won't stop you, I will." I didn't respond. I just watched her go, the echoes of her heels fading into the hallway. For the first time in months, the silence that followed didn't feel like defeat. It felt like the calm before the next storm. "You're telling me you're turning it into an Airbnb?" Mike asked, nearly choking on his beer. "You bet." I grinned. "If they think it's a business, I'll make it one." We sat on my back porch that evening, the sun dipping behind the oak branches that held my so-called nuisance. The air was warm and heavy with the scent of cut grass and stubborn defiance. The court had given me breathing room, but I knew Linda Porter wasn't done. She was never done. The woman lived off control like it was oxygen. If she couldn't beat me legally, she'd try socially, politically, or personally. That's when the idea hit me. If she wanted to label my treehouse a business, then I'd turn it into the best business this neighborhood had ever seen. It started small, just a sketch on a napkin. Mike leaned over my shoulder as I scribbled ideas. A spiral staircase here, I said, drawing a looping line. Add skylights, cedar walls, a little kitchenette. Make it cozy, but high-end. Mike laughed. Man, you're out of your mind. Maybe, I said, smiling, but I've been called worse. Over the next few weeks, my backyard became a construction zone all over again. Only this time, every hammer strike carried purpose. The air filled with the rhythmic thud of nails, the hiss of power saws, and the earthy scent of sawdust. I lined the walls with polished cedar planks and built a staircase that curled up the trunk like a ribbon of iron. When the skylights went in, the first morning light spilled through them like something holy. Each upgrade wasn't just wood and screws. It was healing. For months, the treehouse had been a monument to loss, a quiet reminder of what I'd built for my son but never got to share. Now it was becoming something new. A symbol of rebirth. For the first time since Evan's passing, I wasn't building to mourn. I was building to live. By mid-June, it was done. I stood back and looked at what I'd created. The treehouse wasn't just standing, it was shining. The exterior gleamed under the fresh varnish. The inside smelled like honeyed wood and new beginnings. Mike whistled low. You could charge real money for this. I smiled. That's the plan. I spent a late night crafting the listing on Airbnb. Title: The Oak Haven, Sky High Stay. Description: a handcrafted treehouse getaway for dreamers, travelers, and anyone tired of the ordinary. I uploaded photos. Sunlight filtering through the branches. The cozy bed tucked beneath a skylight. The small deck that looked out over the woods like a balcony to peace itself. Before I hit publish, I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the button. This was more than a business. It was a statement. They'd tried to tear it down, and I'd turned it into something people would pay to experience. It was proof that creativity could outsmart control. Click. The listing went live. By morning, I had 2 bookings. By lunch, it was 6. By sunset, every single weekend for the next 3 months was fully booked. My phone buzzed nonstop. Travelers from across the state, some from out of state, all wanting to stay in the famous treehouse the HOA tried to destroy. Mike came over that night, laughing as I showed him the numbers. You did it, man. You actually did it. Yeah, I said, glancing up at the glowing lights through the branches. But wait until Linda sees it. He raised an eyebrow. You think she will? I nodded slowly. Oh, she will. Because sure enough, the next morning, my phone pinged with a notification. A new message from an Airbnb user. The name made my jaw tighten. Linda P. Request to book. You're renting it out? Linda shrieked through the phone, her voice sharp enough to pierce through the static. Yep, I said, leaning back in my chair with a grin. Booked out till Thanksgiving. That violates the bylaws, she snapped. County says otherwise, I replied, enjoying every second of her silence before she hung up. The truth was I'd been waiting for that call. The treehouse wasn't just a quiet little escape anymore. It had become an overnight sensation. Guests from all over the state were flooding my inbox with messages, each one more excited than the last. Within a week, the Oak Haven, Sky High Stay had 5-star reviews across the board. People couldn't get enough of it. Photos of the golden-lit treehouse were popping up on travel blogs, Instagram reels, and Facebook travel groups titled things like Hidden Gems of North Carolina. Then the local news showed up. A reporter and her cameraman stood in my yard one Thursday morning, smiling for the camera. This is Jake Miller, she said into the mic. The man who turned an HOA fight into a 5-star getaway. The segment aired that night under the headline, "The Man Who Outsmarted His HOA." I didn't plan for fame, but I won't lie. It felt good. The next day, neighbors who once avoided eye contact were stopping by to congratulate me. One man, who'd been fined twice last year for leaving his garbage bins out too long, shook my hand and said, "You did what all of us wanted to do." Another neighbor, Mrs. Carter, left a note in my mailbox that read, "Thank you for reminding us that rules don't always mean right." But not everyone was celebrating. Linda Porter's silence was louder than her shouting ever was. She wasn't used to losing, and definitely not in front of the whole county. When she finally resurfaced, she did it the way she always had. Through paperwork. It started with rumors. A few board members leaked word that Linda was drafting something new, a bylaw amendment targeting commercial activity within residential zones. In plain English, that meant me. I could almost picture her sitting in her office, clutching that HOA handbook like it was a holy text, rewriting the rules line by line to claw back her control. But this time, she was too late. Legally, she couldn't touch me. Short-term rentals like Airbnb weren't governed by HOA bylaws. They fell under county zoning regulations, and I had every permit and tax registration in order. The county had even sent me an email congratulating me on contributing to local tourism revenue. I kept my cool whenever I saw her. Once, I even waved as she drove past my house, glaring out from behind her tinted window. The look on her face said it all. She'd tried to bury me with rules, and instead, I'd built a business from the rubble. The success wasn't just mine anymore, though. It became ours. The neighbors started calling the treehouse the lantern, because it lit up at night like a symbol of quiet rebellion. People booked it not just for the view but for the story. The underdog who stood up to the HOA and won. Mike joked that I should build a second one, maybe even start a Defiant Dwellings brand. I laughed, but part of me was tempted, because every booking, every glowing review, every smiling guest stepping onto that wooden deck felt like justice being served. One overnight stay at a time. But I knew Linda wasn't done. People like her never surrender. They regroup. And when I saw a letter from the HOA in my mailbox that Friday, with proposed amendment, no short-term rentals, stamped across the top, I knew the next round of this war had just begun. "We're bringing this before the zoning board," Linda snapped, slamming her folder onto the table. "Perfect," I said calmly. "They're already staying in my treehouse this weekend." The HOA conference room went quiet. You could have heard a pin drop, or in Linda's case, the sound of her blood pressure rising. Her pearls caught the fluorescent light as she glared at me, eyes sharp and cold. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about ego. The woman couldn't stand that she'd lost control of the narrative. That I, the guy she'd tried to bully into submission, had turned her power trip into profit. A week later, a thick envelope showed up in my mailbox. Notice of county zoning hearing. The HOA had officially filed a petition to revoke my short-term rental permit, claiming that excessive visitor traffic and noise disturbances were damaging community integrity. I almost laughed reading it. The only noise that came from my property was birds at dawn and guests clinking wine glasses under the treehouse deck. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. I arrived early, wearing the same boots I'd worn when I built that treehouse. The county meeting room was packed. Neighbors, reporters, and curious locals filled every seat. At the front sat 5 board members, their expressions neutral but weary. They'd clearly seen their fair share of HOA drama. Linda sat on the other side of the room, surrounded by 2 board members and her attorney. Her smile was polished, but her hands fidgeted with her papers. She wanted this win badly. When the session began, her attorney stood up first. "The Oakwood Estates HOA contends that Mr. Miller's structure constitutes a commercial operation incompatible with residential zoning," he said, pacing with false confidence. "The Airbnb has introduced non-residents into our community, causing discomfort among homeowners." The zoning chair nodded slowly, jotting notes. "And your evidence?" Linda rose, handing over printed photos of cars parked neatly in my driveway and screenshots of online reviews. "This isn't a home anymore," she declared. "It's a hotel in the trees." I waited until she sat back down before standing. My palms were steady, calmer than I expected. With respect, sir, I began, addressing the board. I followed every rule that mattered. County permit issued, building inspected and approved, taxes filed quarterly, receipts provided. I handed over a neatly labeled binder filled with paperwork, each page tabbed and color-coded. Everything I've done has been legal, safe, and beneficial. This project hasn't hurt my community. It's brought attention to it. Visitors leave glowing reviews about Oakwood Estates, about the quiet, about how beautiful our neighborhood is. I'm not breaking the law. I'm showcasing what's best about it. The room stayed silent. Then one board member leaned into his mic. Mr. Miller, according to county code, short-term rentals fall under residential use with occupancy turnover. You're within compliance. He turned toward Linda's table, and unless the HOA can provide evidence of zoning violations, this board has no grounds to revoke his permit. The ruling landed like a thunderclap. A few people even clapped quietly before the chair gave them a stern look. Linda's lawyer muttered something, but the board chair was already signing the dismissal order. Petition denied, he said flatly. I turned just in time to see Linda's face drain of color. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers, and stormed out, reporters chasing behind her. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. The local news crews smelled blood in the water. The story that aired that night was brutal. HOA loses legal battle against local homeowners' treehouse business. The headline alone must have driven her mad. But I knew Linda Porter too well to think it was over. People like her don't fade quietly, they scheme in the shadows. That theory proved right 2 nights later when another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one marked urgent. HOA meeting notice. Inside, in Linda's pristine handwriting, were 7 cold words. Vote to remove Jake Miller from HOA membership. All in favor of removing Linda Porter as president? I asked, my voice steady but loud enough to cut through the chaos. Half the room stood up before I even finished the sentence. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Not this soon, not this explosive. But after months of threats, fines, and humiliation, people were done living under Linda's thumb. The HOA meeting that night wasn't calm or polite. It was war in a carpeted conference room. Folding chairs screeched against the floor, papers flew, and voices overlapped in a storm of pent-up anger. The moment I walked in, I could feel the shift. The same neighbors who used to avoid my eyes were now nodding at me, quietly slipping folded sheets of paper into my hand. Each one was a signed petition. Mike had helped organize it over the past 2 weeks, going door to door while I handled the legal side. By the time the meeting started, we had signatures from over 60% of the community, more than enough to call for a board recall. Linda, of course, acted like she was still in control. She stood at the front of the room in her perfectly pressed blazer, calling the meeting to order like a queen addressing her subjects, but her voice trembled. Just slightly. Before we begin, she announced, forcing a smile, I'd like to address some misinformation circulating about recent HOA actions. I raised my hand. Actually, Linda, before you begin, the residents would like to address you. Her smile froze. Excuse me? I stepped forward, unfolding the stack of petitions. 67% of homeowners have signed a recall. We're requesting an immediate vote to remove you as president, effective tonight. The room erupted. People clapped, shouted, even whistled. One man in the back yelled, "About time." Another woman, her voice shaking with anger, stood up and said, "You fined me for planting sunflowers, Linda." Sunflowers. Linda banged her gavel, shouting, "Order, order." But no one listened. The power she'd wielded for years was slipping right through her manicured fingers. "You can't just—" she started. "Yes, we can," I said, cutting her off. Per Section 9 of the HOA bylaws, members can call for a special vote if more than 50% request it. You wrote that rule yourself, remember? She blinked, realizing too late that the very system she'd used to control others was now being turned against her. The next 30 minutes were pure chaos. Residents shouted stories of petty fines, intimidation, and humiliation. One elderly man revealed that she'd threatened to sue him for painting his shutters the wrong shade of white. A young mother spoke through tears saying Linda had harassed her over too many toys in the yard. Every word cracked her perfect facade a little more. By the time the vote began, Linda looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Still standing, still pretending she could control it, but her voice, barely above a whisper as she called for ballots. I didn't need to count them. You could feel the decision before it was official. People rose from their seats, hands raised high. It wasn't just a vote. It was liberation. The secretary read the results. Motion to remove Linda Porter as HOA president passes. For a moment, the room was silent, like no one quite believed it. Then applause broke out. Real applause, the kind that shakes walls and hearts at the same time. Some people hugged, others laughed, a few even cried. Linda just stood there, eyes glassy, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Her gavel slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. I picked it up, placed it gently on the table, and said, "Meeting adjourned." As she turned to leave, I saw it. The look of disbelief, humiliation, and rage all tangled together. She'd built her empire on fear, and it had fallen in a single night. But as the crowd cheered and the air filled with the sound of freedom, I couldn't shake the thought that Linda Porter wasn't finished. And deep down I knew she'd be back for one last round. "You can't do this to me," she screamed as the sheriff escorted her out. "Ma'am," the deputy said calmly, gripping her arm, "you've done this to yourself." The final HOA meeting wasn't supposed to be explosive. At least not publicly. It was advertised as a transition session, a polite way of saying Linda Porter's exit interview. But everyone in Oakwood Estates knew something big was coming. The clubhouse was packed that night, standing room only. Residents crowded near the windows, whispering like spectators before a storm. I sat in the back, quiet, watching it all unfold with the strange stillness of someone who'd already lived through the worst. Linda walked in late, as if timing her entrance for maximum attention. She still wore her signature blazer and pearls, though her face had lost that polished confidence. Her replacement, a soft-spoken man named Harold, opened the meeting with a rehearsed line. "Tonight, we'll be reviewing financial disclosures from the previous administration." That was the spark that lit the fuse. He clicked on a slideshow. Receipts, wire transfers, and bank statements flashed on the projector screen, all traced back to HOA accounts Linda had controlled for years. Thousands spent on community beautification, which turned out to be her private landscaping. HOA debit card charges for maintenance trips, which matched up perfectly with her hotel stays in Florida. And a $4,200 consulting fee to a company that didn't even exist. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts. One woman stood and yelled, "You made me pay late fees for a fence color while you were using our money for vacations." Linda tried to recover. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice cracking. "All expenditures were approved by the board." "Except you were the board," Harold said, flipping to the next slide. "Every authorization signature. Yours." Her mask shattered right there. She slammed her folder shut, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. "You don't understand. This is political. It's personal revenge," she shouted. "No, Linda," I said quietly from the back. "It's justice." The sheriff stepped forward then. Two deputies, actually, both wearing their badges like punctuation marks. "Ms. Porter," one of them said, "we have an order from the county auditor's office to take you in for questioning regarding potential misuse of association funds." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. For years she'd been the loudest voice in every room. Now you could barely hear her whisper, "You can't do this to me," as the deputies took her by the arm. "Ma'am," the sheriff said again, voice low but firm, "you've done this to yourself." She didn't fight. She didn't even look back. As they led her out through the double doors, the sound of her heels echoed. Sharp, slow, final. When the doors closed, no one cheered. Not at first. It was as if the whole room was holding its breath, letting years of tension bleed out quietly. Then one by one people began to clap. A slow, steady rhythm that grew until it filled the room. It wasn't celebration. It was relief. That night, as I walked home under the soft glow of the treehouse lights, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. The war was over. The oak branches above rustled in the evening breeze, and for the first time they didn't sound like warning signs. They sounded like gratitude. The county would sort out the legal mess, but I already knew the outcome. She'd face fines, maybe even restitution. It turns out that under state law, HOA board members can be held personally liable for misusing association funds. And Linda had left a trail a mile wide. As for me, I was finally free. But not finished. The Oak Haven had become something bigger than a rebellion. It was a symbol of resilience. So I made a decision right there, under those glowing lights. I'd expand it, build another unit, maybe two. A full backyard retreat brand. Not out of spite, not for revenge, but because every board, every nail, and every guest who stayed there would stand as proof that sometimes the best way to win is to build higher than they can reach. You ever think she'll try coming back? Mike asked, sipping his coffee under the treehouse deck. Only if she books a night, I said with a grin. A year had passed since the chaos, the lawsuits, the shouting matches, the endless letters in my mailbox. The storm that once consumed every part of my life had finally settled, leaving behind something stronger, something unshakable. The Oak Haven stood above me, wrapped in morning sunlight and covered in a soft curtain of ivy. It was no longer a battleground. It was a landmark. The treehouse that Linda Porter once called an eyesore was now a state-featured Airbnb destination. It had been written about in 2 travel magazines, filmed for a local tourism campaign, and even featured on a national blog called Hidden Getaways USA. Guests came from across the country, families, couples, even a few veterans who said they'd heard my story online and just wanted to stay somewhere built by a man who didn't give up. Every weekend, laughter drifted down from the deck. The same kind of laughter I used to hear from Evan when he was little. Sometimes I'd sit outside with my coffee, close my eyes, and let it take me back. Only this time, it didn't hurt. It healed. The neighborhood had changed too. Without Linda's constant shadow, people started reclaiming their freedom. Lawns grew a little more colorful. Mailboxes didn't match anymore. And nobody cared. Kids played in the cul-de-sacs without parents worrying about noise ordinance. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. At one of the first HOA meetings under new leadership, Harold, the new president, approached me in front of everyone. "Jake," he said, "on behalf of the board and the entire community, I owe you an apology. We should have stood by you sooner." The room went quiet. I could feel the weight of 100 eyes on me, but for once, they weren't judging. They were grateful. I nodded. "No hard feelings," I said. "Just glad we can finally live like neighbors instead of suspects." The applause that followed wasn't loud or forced. It was warm, genuine, the kind that says we learned something. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Mike joined me out back. The two of us sat beneath the oak tree where it all started, watching the glow of the treehouse lights flicker to life above us. "You know," he said, "most folks would have given up." "Yeah," I replied quietly, "but giving up doesn't rebuild anything." He chuckled. "So what's next, partner? You going corporate with this thing?" "Not corporate," I said, glancing up. "But I'm thinking of expanding, maybe 2 more cabins. Keep it small. Keep it honest." He nodded approvingly. "From eyesore to empire, huh?" "Not an empire," I said with a smile. "A reminder that when you build something out of love, no amount of paperwork can take it away." The treehouse lights shimmered through the branches as a car pulled up out front, a new guest checking in. A young couple waved, smiling wide, their faces full of excitement. For them, it was just a stay. For me, it was proof that justice doesn't always come with sirens or gavels. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the form of a sunrise over something they said you couldn't build. I stood, brushing sawdust off my jeans, and looked at the sign hanging from the staircase. The Oak Haven, built to last. Then I turned back to the camera, the same way I always do at the HOA. End of my stories. What would you do? I asked. If your HOA tried to tear down your dream, would you fight back like I did? Drop your story in the comments and hit like if you'd turn their rules into your revenge.